I am helping him with the case, she explained. I felt rather uneasy. Caroline is bad enough as it is. What will she be like with her detective instincts encouraged? Are you going round the neighborhood looking for Ralph Payton's mysterious girl? I inquired. Elle might do that on my own account, said Caroline. No, this is a special thing M. Poirot wants me to find out for him. What is it? I asked. He wants to know whether Ralph Payton's boots were black or brown, said Caroline with tremendous solemnity. I stared at her. I see now that I was unbelievably stupid about these boots. I failed altogether to grasp the point. They were brown shoes, I said. Elle saw them. Not shoes, James, boots. M. Poirot wants to know whether a pair of boots Ralph had with him at the hotel were brown or black. A lot hangs on it. Call me dense if you like. I didn't see. And how are you going to find out? I asked. Caroline said there would be no difficulty about that. Our Annie's dearest friend was Miss Gannett's maid, Clara. And Clara was walking out with the boots at the Three Boars. The whole thing was simplicity itself, and by the aid of Miss Gannett, who cooperated loyally, at once giving Clara leave of absence, the matter was rushed through at express speed. It was when we were sitting down to lunch that Caroline remarked, with would-be unconcern, about those boots of Ralph Payton's. Well, I said, what about them? M. Poirot thought they were probably brown. He was wrong. They're black. And Caroline nodded her head several times. She evidently felt that she had scored a point over Poirot. I did not answer. I was puzzling over what the color of a pair of Ralph Payton's boots had to do with the case. Point 15 Geoffrey Raymond. I was to have a further proof that day of the success of Poirot's tactics. That challenge of his had been a subtle touch born of his knowledge of human nature. A mixture of fear and guilt had wrung the truth from Mrs. Ackroyd. She was the first to react. That afternoon when I returned from seeing my patients, Caroline told me that Geoffrey Raymond had just left. Did he want to see me? I asked, as I hung up my coat in the hall. Caroline was hovering by my elbow. It was M. Poirot he wanted to see, she said. He'd just come from the Larches. Mr. Poirot was out. Mr. Raymond thought that he might be here, or that you might know where he was. Elle haven't the least idea. Elle tried to make him wait, said Caroline, but he said he would call back at the Larches in half an hour, and went away down the village. A great pity, because M. Poirot came in practically the minute after he left. Came in here? No, to his own house. How do you know? The side window, said Caroline briefly. It seemed to me that we had now exhausted the topic. Caroline thought of the miss. Aren't you going across? Across where? To the Larches, of course. My dear Caroline, I said, what for? Mr. Raymond wanted to see him very particularly, said Caroline. You might hear what it's all about. I raised my eyebrows. Curiosity is not my besetting sin, I remarked coldly. I can exist comfortably without knowing exactly what my neighbors are doing and thinking. Stuff and nonsense, James, said my sister. You want to know just as much as I do. You're not so honest, that's all. You always have to pretend. Really, Caroline, I said, and retired into my surgery. 10 minutes later Caroline tapped at the door and entered. In her hand she held what seemed to be a pot of jam. I'll wonder, James, she said, if you would mind taking this pot of medlar jelly across to M. Poirot? I promised it to him. He has never tasted any homemade medlar jelly. Why can't Annie go? I asked coldly. She's doing some mending. I can't spare her. Caroline and I looked at each other. Very well, I said, rising. But if I take the beastly thing, I shall just leave it at the door. You understand that? My sister raised her eyebrows. Naturally, she said. Who suggested you should do anything? The honors were with Caroline. If you do happen to see M. Poirot, she said, as I opened the front door, you might tell him about the boots. It was a most subtle parting shot. I wanted dreadfully to understand the enigma of the boots. When the old lady with the Breton cap opened the door to me, I found myself asking if M. Poirot was in, quite automatically. Poirot sprang up to meet me, with every appearance of pleasure. "Sit down, my good friend," he said. "The big chair? This small one? The room is not too hot, no." I thought it was stifling, but refrained from saying so. The windows were closed, and a large fire burned in the grate. "The English people, they have a mania for the fresh air," declared Poirot. "The big air, it is all very well outside, where it belongs. Why admit it to the house? But let us not discuss such banalities. You have something for me, yes." "Two things," I said. "First this from my sister." I handed over the pot of medlar jelly. "How kind of Mademoiselle Caroline. She has remembered her promise." "And the second thing?" "Information of a kind." And I told him of my interview with Mrs. Ackroyd. He listened with interest, but not much excitement. "It clears the ground," he said thoughtfully. "And it has a certain value as confirming the evidence of the housekeeper. She said, you remember, that she found the silver table lid open and closed it down in passing. What about her statement that she went into the drawing room to see if the flowers were fresh? Ah! We never took that very seriously, did we, my friend? It was patently an excuse, trumped up in a hurry, by a woman who felt it urgent to explain her presence, which, by the way, you would probably never have thought of questioning. I considered it possible that her agitation might arise from the fact that she had been tampering with the silver table, but I think now that we must look for another cause." "Yes," I said. "Whom did she go out to meet? And why?" "You think she went to meet someone?" "I do." Poirot nodded. "So do I," he said thoughtfully. There was a pause. "By the way," I said, "I've got a message for you from my sister." Ralph Peyton's boots were black, not brown. I was watching him closely as I gave the message, and I fancied that I saw a momentary flicker of discomposure. If so, it passed almost immediately. "She is absolutely positive they are not brown." "Absolutely." "Ah," said Poirot regretfully. "That is a pity." And he seemed quite crestfallen. He entered into no explanations, but at once started a new subject of conversation. "The housekeeper, Miss Russell, who came to consult you on that Friday morning. Is it indiscreet to ask what passed at the interview apart from the medical details, I mean?" "Not at all," I said. When the professional part of the conversation was over, we talked for a few minutes about poisons, and the ease or difficulty of detecting them, and about drug taking and drug takers. "With special reference to cocaine?" asked Poirot. "How did you know?" I asked, somewhat surprised. For answer, the little man rose and crossed the room to where newspapers were filed. He brought me a copy of the Daily Budget, dated Friday, September 16th, and showed me an article dealing with the smuggling of cocaine. It was a somewhat lurid article, written with an eye to picturesque effect. "That is what put cocaine into her head, my friend," he said. I would have catechized him further, for I did not quite understand his meaning, but at that moment the door opened and Geoffrey Raymond was announced. He came in fresh and debonair as ever, and greeted us both. "How are you, Doctor?" "M. Poirot, this is the second time I've been here this morning. I was anxious to catch you." "Perhaps I'd better be off," I suggested rather awkwardly. "Not on my account, Doctor." "No, it's just this," he went on, seating himself at a wave of invitation from Poirot. "I've got a confession to make." "En vérité," said Poirot, with an air of polite interest. "Oh, it's of no consequence, really. But, as a matter of fact, my conscience has been pricking me ever since yesterday afternoon. You accused us all of keeping back something, M. Poirot. I plead guilty. I've had something up my sleeve." "And what is that, M. Raymond?" "As I say, it's nothing of consequence, just this. I was in debt badly, and that legacy came in the nick of time. £500 puts me on my feet again with a little to spare." He smiled at us both with that engaging frankness that made him such a likable youngster. "You know how it is. Suspicious-looking policemen don't like to admit you were hard up for money, think it will look bad to them. But I was a fool, really, because Blunt and I were in the billiard room from 9:45 onwards, so I've got a watertight alibi and nothing to fear. Still, when you thundered out that stuff about concealing things, I felt a nasty prick of conscience, and I thought I'd like to get it off my mind." He got up again and stood smiling at us. "You are a very wise young man," said Poirot, nodding at him with approval. "See you, when I know that anyone is hiding things from me, I suspect that the thing hidden may be something very bad indeed. You have done well." "I'm glad I'm cleared from suspicion," laughed Raymond. "I'll be off now." "So that is that," I remarked, as the door closed behind the young secretary. "Yes," agreed Poirot. "A mere bagatelle, but if he had not been in the billiard room, who knows? After all, many crimes have been committed for the sake of less than £500. It all depends on what sum is sufficient to break a man. A question of relativity, is it not so? Have you reflected, my friend, that many people in that house stood to benefit by Mr. Ackroyd's death? Mrs. Ackroyd, Miss Flora, young Mr. Raymond, the housekeeper, Miss Russell. Only one, in fact, does not, Major Blunt." His tone in uttering that name was so peculiar that I looked up, puzzled. "Don't understand you," I said. "Two of the people I accused have given me the truth." "You think Major Blunt has something to conceal also?" "As for that," remarked Poirot nonchalantly, "there is a saying, is there not, that Englishmen conceal only one thing, their love? And Major Blunt, I should say, is not at concealments." "Sometimes," I said, "I'll wonder if we haven't rather jumped to conclusions on one point." "What is that?" "We've assumed that the blackmailer of Mrs. Ferrars is necessarily the murderer of Mr. Ackroyd. Might we be mistaken?" Poirot nodded energetically. "Very good. Very good indeed. I wondered if that idea would come to you. Of course it is possible. But we must remember one point. The letter disappeared. Still, that, as you say, may not necessarily mean that the murderer took it. When you first found the body, Parker may have abstracted the letter unnoticed by you." "Parker?" "Yes, Parker. I always come back to Parker not as the murderer, no, he did not commit the murder, but who is more suitable than he as the mysterious scoundrel who terrorized Mrs. Ferrars. He may have got his information about Mr. Ferrars's death from one of the King's paddock servants. At any rate, he is more likely to have come upon it than a casual guest such as Blunt, for instance." "Parker might have taken the letter," I admitted. "It wasn't till later that I noticed it was gone." "How much later?" "After Blunt and Raymond were in the room, or before?" Can't remember," I said slowly. Think it was before, no, afterwards." "Yes, I'm almost sure it was afterwards." "That widens the field to 3, said Poirot thoughtfully. "But Parker is the most likely. It is in my mind to try a little experiment with Parker. How say you, my friend, will you accompany me to Fernley?" I acquiesced, and we set out at once. Poirot asked to see Miss Ackroyd, and presently Flora came to us. "Mademoiselle Flora," said Poirot, "I have to confide in you a little secret. I am not yet satisfied of the innocence of Parker. I propose to make a little experiment with your assistance. I want to reconstruct some of his actions on that night. But we must think of something to tell him. I have it. I wish to satisfy myself as to whether voices in the little lobby could have been heard outside on the terrace. Now, ring for Parker, if you will be so good." I did so, and presently the butler appeared, suave as ever. "You rang, sir?" "Yes, my good Parker. I have in mind a little experiment. I have placed Major Blunt on the terrace outside the study window. I want to see if anyone there could have heard the voices of Miss Ackroyd and yourself in the lobby that night. I want to enact that little scene over again. Perhaps you would fetch the tray or whatever it was you were carrying." Parker vanished, and we repaired to the lobby outside the study door. Presently we heard a chink in the outer hall, and Parker appeared in the doorway carrying a tray with a siphon, a decanter of whiskey, and 2 glasses on it. "One moment," cried Poirot, raising his hand and seemingly very excited. "We must have everything in order, just as it occurred. It is a little method of mine." "A foreign custom, sir," said Parker. "Reconstruction of the crime they call it, do they not?" He was quite imperturbable as he there politely waiting on Poirot's orders. "Ah! He knows something, the good Parker," cried Poirot. "He has read of these things. Now, I beg you, let us have everything of the most exact. You came from the outer hall, so Mademoiselle was where?" "Here," said Flora, taking up her stand just outside the study door. "Quite right, sir," said Parker. "I had just closed the door," continued Flora. "Yes, miss," agreed Parker. "Your hand was still on the handle as it is now." "Then allez," said Poirot. "Play me the little comedy." Flora stood with her hand on the door handle, and Parker came stepping through the door from the hall, bearing the tray. He stopped just inside the door. Flora spoke. "Oh, Parker. Mr. Ackroyd doesn't want to be disturbed again tonight. Is that right?" she added in an undertone. "To the best of my recollection, Miss Flora," said Parker, "but I fancy you used the word evening instead of night." Then, raising his voice in a somewhat theatrical fashion, "Very good, miss, shall I lock up as usual?" "Yes, please." Parker retired through the door. Flora followed him, and started to ascend the main staircase. "Is that enough?" she asked over her shoulder. "Admirable," declared the little man, rubbing his hands. "By the way, Parker, are you sure there were 2 glasses on the tray that evening? Who was the second one for?" "I'll always bring 2 glasses, sir," said Parker. "Is there anything further?" "Nothing. I thank you." Parker withdrew, dignified to the last. Poirot stood in the middle of the hall frowning. Flora came down and joined us. "Has your experiment been successful?" she asked. "I don't quite understand, you know." Poirot smiled admiringly at her. "It is not necessary that you should," he said. "But tell me, were there indeed 2 glasses on Parker's tray that night?" Flora wrinkled her brows a minute. "I really can't remember," she said. "I think there were. Is that the object of your experiment?" Poirot took her hand and patted it. "Put it this way," he said. "I am always interested to see if people will speak the truth." "And did Parker speak the truth?" "I rather think he did," said Poirot thoughtfully. "A few minutes later saw us retracing our steps to the village." "What was the point of that question about the glasses?" I asked curiously. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "One must say something," he remarked. That particular question did as well as any other. I stared at him. "At any rate, my friend," he said seriously, "I'll know now something I wanted to know. Let us leave it at that. 16 an evening at Mahjong that night we had a little Mahjong party. This kind of simple entertainment is very popular in King's Abbot. The guests arrive in galoshes and waterproofs after dinner. They partake of coffee and later of cake, sandwiches and tea. On this particular night our guests were Miss Gannett and Colonel Carter, who lives near the church. A good deal of gossip is handed round at these evenings, sometimes seriously interfering with the game in progress. We used to play bridge, chatty bridge of the worst description. We find Mahjong much more peaceful. The irritated demand as to why on earth your partner did not lead a certain card is entirely done away with, and though we still express criticisms frankly, there is not the same acrimonious spirit. "Very cold evening, Shepherd," said Colonel Carter, standing with his back to the fire. Caroline had taken Miss Gannett to her own room, and was there assisting her to disentangle herself from her many wraps. "Reminds me of the Afghan passes." "Indeed," I said politely. "Very mysterious business this about poor Ackroyd," continued the Colonel, accepting a cup of coffee. "A deuce of a lot behind it, that's what I say. Between you and me, Shepherd, I've heard the word blackmail mentioned." The Colonel gave me the look which might be tabulated, one man of the world to another. "A woman in it, no doubt," he said. "Depend upon it, a woman in Caroline and Miss Gannett joined us at this minute. Miss Gannett drank coffee whilst Caroline got out the mahjong box and poured out the tiles upon the table. "Washing the tiles," said the Colonel facetiously. "That's right, washing the tiles, as we used to say in the Shanghai Club. It is the private opinion of both Caroline and myself that Colonel Carter has never been in the Shanghai Club in his life. More, that he has never been farther east than India, where he juggled with tins of bully beef and plum and apple jam during the Great War. But the Colonel is determinately military, and in King's Abbot we permit people to indulge their little idiosyncrasies freely." "Shall we begin?" said Caroline. We sat round the table. For some 5 minutes there was complete silence, owing to the fact that there is tremendous secret competition amongst us as to who can build their wall quickest. "Go on, James," said Caroline at last. "Your east wind." I discarded a tile. A round or two proceeded, broken by the monotonous remarks of 3 bamboos, 2 circles, pung, and frequently from Miss Gannett unpung, owing to that lady's habit of too hastily claiming tiles to which she had no right. "Elle saw Flora Ackroyd this morning," said Miss Gannett. "Pung no unpung. I made a mistake." "4 circles," said Caroline. "Where did you see her?" "She didn't see me," said Miss Gannett, with that tremendous significance only to be met with in small villages. "Ah," said Caroline interestedly. "Chow. "I'll believe," said Miss Gannett, temporarily diverted, "that it's the right thing nowadays to say chi not chow." "Nonsense," said Caroline. "I have always said chow." "In the Shanghai Club," said Colonel Carter, "they say chow." Miss Gannett retired, crushed. "What were you saying about Flora Ackroyd?" asked Caroline, after a moment or two devoted to the game. "Was she with anyone?" "Very much so," said Miss Gannett. The eyes of the 2 ladies met, and seemed to exchange information. "Really," said Caroline interestedly. "Is that it? Well, it doesn't surprise me in the least." "We're waiting for you to discard, Miss Caroline," said the Colonel. He sometimes affects the pose of the bluff male, intent on the game and indifferent to gossip. But nobody is deceived. "If you ask me," said Miss Gannett. "Was that a bamboo you discarded, dear?" "Oh. No, I see now it was a circle. As I was saying, if you ask me, Flora's been exceedingly lucky." "Exceedingly lucky she's been. How's that, Miss Gannett?" asked the Colonel. "I'll pung that green dragon. How do you make out that Miss Flora's been lucky?" "Very charming girl and all that, I know. Elle maintient know very much about crime," said Miss Gannett, with the air of one who knows everything there is to know, "but I can tell you one thing. The first question that's always asked is, who last saw the deceased alive? And the person who did is regarded with suspicion. Now, Flora Ackroyd last saw her uncle alive. It might have looked very nasty for her, very nasty indeed. It's my opinion, and I give it for what it's worth, that Ralph Peyton is staying away on her account, to draw suspicion away from her." "Come, now," I protested mildly, "you surely can't suggest that a young girl like Flora Ackroyd is capable of stabbing her uncle in cold blood." "Well, I don't know," said Miss Gannett. "I've just been reading a book from the library about the underworld of Paris, and it says that some of the worst women criminals are young girls with the faces of angels." "That's in France," said Caroline instantly. "Just so," said the Colonel. "Now, I'll tell you a very curious thing, a story that was going round the bazaars in India." The Colonel's story was one of interminable length, and of curiously little interest. A thing that happened in India many years ago cannot compare for a moment with an event that took place in King's Abbot the day before yesterday. It was Caroline who brought the Colonel's story to a close by fortunately going mahjong. After the slight unpleasantness always caused by my corrections of Caroline's somewhat faulty arithmetic, we started a new hand. "East wind passes," said Caroline. "I've got an idea of my own about Ralph Peyton. 3 characters. But I'm keeping it to myself for the present." "Are you, dear?" said Miss Gannett. "Chow, I mean pung." "Yes," said Caroline firmly. "Was it all right about the boots?" asked Miss Gannett. "Their being black, I mean." "Quite all right," said Caroline. What was the point, do you think? Asked Miss Gannett. Caroline pursed up her lips, and shook her head with an air of knowing all about it. Pung, said Miss Gannett. No unpung. I suppose that now the doctor's in with M. Poirot he knows all the secrets. Far from it, I said. James is so modest, said Caroline. Ah. A concealed Kong. The Colonel gave vent to a whistle. For the moment gossip was forgotten. Your own wind, too, he said. And you've got 2 pungs of dragons. We must be careful. Miss Caroline's out for a big hand. We played for some minutes with no irrelevant conversation. This M. Poirot now, said Colonel Carter, is he really such a great detective? The greatest the world has ever known, said Caroline solemnly. He had to come here incognito to avoid publicity. Chow, said Miss Gannett. Quite wonderful for our little village, I'm sure. By the way, Clara my maid, you know is great friends with Elsie, the housemaid at Fernley, and what do you think Elsie told her? That there's been a lot of money stolen, and it's her opinion Elsie's I mean, that the parlour maid had something to do with it. She's leaving at the month, and she's crying a good deal at night. If you ask me, the girl is very likely in league with the gang. She's always been a queer girl, she's not friends with any of the girls round here. She goes off by herself on her days out, very unnatural, I call it, and most suspicious. I asked her once to come to our girls' friendly evenings, but she refused, and then I asked her a few questions about her home and her family, all that sort of thing, and I'm bound to say I considered her manner most impertinent. Outwardly very respectful, but she shut me up in the most barefaced way. Miss Gannett stopped for breath, and the Colonel, who was totally uninterested in the servant question, remarked that in the Shanghai Club brisk play was the invariable rule. We had a round of brisk play. That Miss Russell, said Caroline. She came here pretending to consult James on Friday morning. It's my opinion she wanted to see where the poisons were kept. 5 characters. Chow, said Miss Gannett. What an extraordinary idea. I wonder if you can be right. Talking of poisons, said the Colonel. What? Haven't I discarded? Oh. 8 bamboos. Mahjong, said Miss Gannett. Caroline was very much annoyed. 1 red dragon, she said regretfully, and I should have had a hand of 3 doubles. I've had 2 red dragons all the time, I mentioned. So exactly like you, James, said Caroline reproachfully. You've no conception of the spirit of the game. I myself thought I had played rather cleverly. I should have had to pay Caroline an enormous amount if she had gone mahjong. Miss Gannett's mahjong was of the poorest variety possible, as Caroline did not fail to point out to her. East wind passed, and we started a new hand in silence. What I was going to tell you just now was this, said Caroline. Yes, said Miss Gannett encouragingly. My idea about Ralph Peyton, I mean. Yes, dear, said Miss Gannett, still more encouragingly. Chow. It's a sign of weakness to chow so early, said Caroline severely. You should go for a big hand. No, said Miss Gannett. You were saying about Ralph Peyton, you know. Yes. Well, I've a pretty shrewd idea where he is. We all stopped to stare at her. This is very interesting, Miss Caroline, said Colonel Carter. All your own idea, eh? Well, not exactly. I'll tell you about it. You know that big map of the county we have in the hall? We all said yes. As M. Poirot was going out the other day, he stopped and looked at it, and he made some remark, I can't remember exactly what it was. Something about Cranchester being the only big town anywhere near us, which is true, of course. But after he had gone it came to me suddenly. What came to you? His meaning. Of course Ralph is in Cranchester. It was at that moment that I knocked down the rack that held my pieces. My sister immediately reproved me for clumsiness, but half-heartedly. She was intent on her theory. Cranchester, Miss Caroline, said Colonel Carter. Surely not Cranchester. It's so near. That's exactly it, cried Caroline triumphantly. It seems quite clear by now that he didn't get away from here by train. He must simply have walked into Cranchester. And I believe he's there still. No one would dream of his being so near at hand. I pointed out several objections to the theory, but when once Caroline has got something firmly into her head, nothing dislodges it. And you think M. Poirot has the same idea, said Miss Gannett thoughtfully. It's a curious coincidence, but I was out for a walk this afternoon on the Cranchester Road, and he passed me in a car coming from that direction. We all looked at each other. Why, dear me, said Miss Gannett suddenly, I'm mahjong all the time, and I never noticed it. Caroline's attention was distracted from her own inventive exercises. She pointed out to Miss Gannett that a hand consisting of mixed suits and too many chows was hardly worth going mahjong on. Miss Gannett listened imperturbably and collected her counters. Yes, dear, I know what you mean, she said. But it rather depends on what kind of a hand you have to start with, doesn't it? You'll never get the big hands if you don't go for them, urged Caroline. Well, we must all play our own way, mustn't we, said Miss Gannett. She looked down at her counters. After all, I'm up, so far. Caroline, who was considerably down, said nothing. East wind passed, and we set to once more. Annie brought in the tea things. Caroline and Miss Gannett were both slightly ruffled, as is often the case during one of these festive evenings. If you would only play a little quicker, dear, said Caroline, as Miss Gannett hesitated over her discard. The Chinese put down the tiles so quickly it sounds like little birds pattering. For some minutes we played like the Chinese. You haven't contributed much to the sum of information, Shepherd, said Colonel Carter genially. You're a sly dog. Hand in glove with the great detective, and not a hint as to the way things are going. James is an extraordinary creature, said Caroline. He cannot bring himself to part with information. She looked at me with some disfavor. I'll assure you, I said, that I don't know anything. Poirot keeps his own counsel. Wise man, said the Colonel with a chuckle. He doesn't give himself away. But they're wonderful fellows, these foreign detectives. Up to all sorts of, I believe. Pung, said Miss Gannett, in a tone of quiet triumph. And mahjong. The situation became more strained. It was annoyance at Miss Gannett's going mahjong for the third time running which prompted Caroline to say to me as we built a fresh wall, You are too tiresome, James. You sit there like a deadhead, and say nothing at all. But, my dear, I protested, I have really nothing to say that is, of the kind you mean. Nonsense, said Caroline, as she sorted her hand. You must know something interesting. I did not answer for a moment. I was overwhelmed and intoxicated. I had read of there being such a thing as the perfect winning going mahjong on one's original hand. I had never hoped to hold the hand myself. With suppressed triumph I laid my hand face upwards on the table. As they say in the Shanghai Club, I remarked, Tin ho, the perfect winning. The Colonel's eyes nearly bulged out of his head. Upon my soul, he said. What an extraordinary thing. I never saw that happen before. It was then that I went on, goaded by Caroline's jibes, and rendered reckless by my triumph. And as to anything interesting, I said. What about a gold wedding ring with a date and from our inside? I pass over the scene that followed. I was made to say exactly where this treasure was found. I was made to reveal the date. March 13, said Caroline. Just 6 months ago. Ah. Out of a babble of excited suggestions and suppositions 3 theories were evolved. One, that of Colonel Carter, that Ralph was secretly married to Flora. The first or most simple solution. 2, that of Miss Gannett. That Roger Ackroyd had been secretly married to Mrs. Ferrars. 3, that of my sister, that Roger Ackroyd had married his housekeeper, Miss Russell. A 4th or super theory was propounded by Caroline later as we went up to bed. Mark my words, she said suddenly, Elle shouldn't be at all surprised if Geoffrey Raymond and Flora weren't married. Surely it would be from G, not from R then, I suggested. You never know. Some girls call men by their surnames. And you heard what Miss Gannett said this evening about Flora's carryings on. Strictly speaking, I had not heard Miss Gannett say anything of the kind, but I respected Caroline's knowledge of innuendos. "How about Hector Blunt?" I hinted. "If it's nonsense," said Caroline, "I'll dare say he admires her, may even be in love with her. But depend upon it, a girl isn't going to fall in love with a man old enough to be her father when there's a good-looking secretary about. She may encourage Major Blunt just as a blind. Girls are very artful. But there's one thing I do tell you, James Shepherd. Flora Ackroyd does not care a penny piece for Ralph Peyton, and never has. You can take it from me." I took it from her meekly. 17 Parker. It occurred to me the next morning that under the exhilaration produced by Tinho or the perfect winning, I might have been slightly indiscreet. True, Poirot had not asked me to keep the discovery of the ring to myself. On the other hand, he had said nothing about it whilst at Fernley, and as far as I knew, I was the only person aware that it had been found. I felt distinctly guilty. The fact was by now spreading through King's Abbot like wildfire. I was expecting wholesale reproaches from Poirot any minute. The joint funeral of Mrs. Ferrars and Roger Ackroyd was fixed for 11 o'clock. It was a melancholy and impressive ceremony. All the party from Fernley were there. After it was over, Poirot, who had also been present, took me by the arm, and invited me to accompany him back to the Larches. He was looking very grave, and I feared that my indiscretion of the night before had got round to his ears. But it soon transpired that his thoughts were occupied by something of a totally different nature. "See you," he said. "We must act. With your help I propose to examine a witness. We will question him, we will put such fear into him that the truth is bound to come out." "What witness are you talking about?" I asked, very much surprised. "Parker," said Poirot. "Elle asked him to be at my house this morning at 12 o'clock. He should await us there at this very minute. What do you think?" I ventured, glancing sideways at his face. "Elle know this that I am not satisfied. You think that it was he who blackmailed Mrs. Ferrars?" "Either that, or, well," I said, after waiting a minute or two. "My friend, I will say this to you, I hope it was he." The gravity of his manner, and something indefinable that tinged it, reduced me to silence. On arrival at the Larches, we were informed that Parker was already there awaiting our return. As we entered the room, the butler rose respectfully. "Good morning, Parker," said Poirot pleasantly. "One instant, I pray of you." He removed his overcoat and gloves. "Allow me, sir," said Parker, and sprang forward to assist him. He deposited the articles neatly on a chair by the door. Poirot watched him with approval. "Thank you, my good Parker," he said. "Take a seat, will you not? What I have to say may take some time." Parker seated himself with an apologetic bend of the head. "Now what do you think I asked you to come here for this morning, eh?" Parker coughed. "Elle understood, sir, that you wished to ask me a few questions about my late master private-like." "Precisement," said Poirot, beaming. "Have you made many experiments in blackmail?" "Sir." The butler sprang to his feet. "Do not excite yourself," said Poirot placidly. "Do not play the farce of the honest, injured man. You know all there is to know about the blackmail, is it not so?" "Sir, I've never been insulted," suggested Poirot, "in such a way before." "Then why, my excellent Parker, were you so anxious to overhear the conversation in Mr. Ackroyd's study the other evening, after you had caught the word blackmail?" "Elle wasn't who was your last master," rapped out Poirot suddenly. "My last master?" "Yes, the master you were with before you came to Mr. Ackroyd, a Major Ellerby." Sir Poirot took the words out of his mouth. "Just so. Major Ellerby. Major Ellerby was addicted to drugs, was he not? You traveled about with him. When he was in Bermuda there was some trouble, a man was killed. Major Ellerby was partly responsible. It was hushed up. But you knew about it. How much did Major Ellerby pay you to keep your mouth shut?" Parker was staring at him open-mouthed. The man had gone to pieces, his cheeks shook flabbily. "You see, I have made inquiries," said Poirot pleasantly. "It is as I say. You got a good sum then as blackmail, and Major Ellerby went on paying you until he died. Now I want to hear about your latest experiment." Parker still stared. "It is useless to deny. Hercule Poirot knows. It is so, what I have said about Major Ellerby, is it not?" As though against his will, Parker reluctantly once. His face was ashen pale. "But I never hurt a hair of Mr. Ackroyd's head," he moaned. "Honest to God, sir, I didn't. I've been afraid of this coming all the time. And I tell you I didn't kill him." His voice rose almost to a scream. "I am inclined to believe you, my friend," said Poirot. "You have not the nerve, the courage. But I must have the truth. I'll tell you anything, sir, anything you want to know. It's true that I tried to listen that night. A word or two I heard made me curious. And Mr. Ackroyd's wanting not to be disturbed, and shutting himself up with the doctor the way he did. It's God's own truth what I told the police. I heard the word blackmail, sir, and well." He paused. "You thought there might be something in it for you," suggested Poirot smoothly. Well, yes, I did, sir. I thought that if Mr. Ackroyd was being blackmailed, why shouldn't I have a share of the pickings?" A very curious expression passed over Poirot's face. He leaned forward. "Had you any reason to suppose before that night that Mr. Ackroyd was being blackmailed?" "No, indeed, sir. It was a great surprise to me. Such a regular gentleman in all his habits." "How much did you overhear?" "Not very much, sir. There seemed what I might call a spite against me. Of course I had to attend to my duties in the pantry. And when I did creep along once or twice to the study it was no use. The first time Dr. Shepherd came out and almost caught me in the act, and another time Mr. Raymond passed me in the big hall and went that way, so I knew it was no use, and when I went with the tray, Miss Flora headed me off." Poirot stared for a long time at the man, as if to test his sincerity. Parker returned his gaze earnestly. "I hope you believe me, sir. I've been afraid all along the police would rake up that old business with Major Ellerby and be suspicious of me in consequence." "Eh bien," said Poirot at last. "I am disposed to believe you. But there is one thing I must request of you, to show me your bank book. You have a bank book, I presume?" "Yes, sir, as a matter of fact, I have it with me now." With no sign of confusion, he produced it from his pocket. Poirot took the slim, green-covered book and perused the entries. "Ah! I perceive you have purchased 2,500 worth of National Savings Certificates this year." "Yes, sir. I have already over £1,000 saved, the result of my connection with my late master, Major Ellerby. And I have had quite a little flutter on some horses this year, very successful. If you remember, sir, a rank outsider won the Jubilee. I was fortunate enough to back it E20. Poirot handed him back the book. "L will wish you good morning. I believe that you have told me the truth. If you have not, so much the worse for you, my friend." When Parker had departed, Poirot picked up his overcoat once more. "Going out again?" I asked. "Yes, we will pay a little visit to the good M. Hammond." "You believe Parker's story?" "It is credible enough on the face of it. It seems clear that unless he is a very good actor, indeed he genuinely believes it was Ackroyd himself who was the victim of blackmail. If so, he knows nothing at all about the Mrs. Ferrars business. Then in that case who, precisement?" "Who? But our visit to M. Hammond will accomplish one purpose. It will either clear Parker completely or else, well, I'll fall into the bad habit of leaving my sentences unfinished this morning," said Poirot apologetically. "You must bear with me. By the way," I said, rather sheepishly, "I've got a confession to make. I'm afraid I have inadvertently let out something about that ring." "What ring?" "The ring you found in the goldfish pond." "Ah. Yes," said Poirot, smiling broadly. "I hope you are not annoyed? It was very careless of me." "But not at all, my good friend, not at all. I laid no commands upon you. You were at liberty to speak of it if you so wished." "She was interested, your sister." She was indeed. It created a sensation. All sorts of theories are flying about. Ah! And yet it is so simple. The true explanation leapt to the eye, did it not? Did it? I said drily. Poirot laughed. The wise man does not commit himself, he observed. Is not that so? But here we are at Mr. Hammond's. The lawyer was in his office, and we were ushered in without any delay. He rose and greeted us in his dry, precise manner. Poirot came at once to the point. Monsieur, I desire from you certain information, that is, if you will be so good as to give it to me. You acted, I understand, for the late Mrs. Ferrars of King's Paddock. I noticed the swift gleam of surprise which showed in the lawyer's eyes, before his professional reserve came down once more like a mask over his face. Certainly. All her affairs passed through our hands. Very good. Now, before I ask you to tell me anything, I should like you to listen to the story Dr. Shepherd will relate to you. You have no objection, have you, my friend, to repeating the conversation you had with Mr. Ackroyd last Friday night? Not in the least, I said, and straightway began the recital of that strange evening. Hammond listened with close attention. That is all, I said, when I had finished. Blackmail, said the lawyer thoughtfully. You are surprised? Asked Poirot. The lawyer took off his pince-nez and polished them with his handkerchief. No, he replied, I can hardly say that I am surprised. I have suspected something of the kind for some time. That brings us, said Poirot, to the information for which I am asking. If anyone can give us an idea of the actual sums paid, you are the man, monsieur. I see no object in withholding the information, said Hammond, after a moment or two. During the past year, Mrs. Ferrars has sold out certain securities, and the money for them was paid into her account and not reinvested. As her income was a large one, and she lived very quietly after her husband's death, it seems certain that these sums of money were paid away for some special purpose. I once sounded her on the subject, and she said that she was obliged to support several of her husband's poor relations. I let the matter drop, of course. Until now, I have always imagined that the money was paid to some woman who had had a claim on Ashley Ferrars. I never dreamed that Mrs. Ferrars herself was involved. And the amount? Asked Poirot. In all, I should say the various sums totaled at least £20,000. £20,000! I exclaimed. In 1 year. Mrs. Ferrars was a very wealthy woman, said Poirot drily. And the penalty for murder is not a pleasant one. Is there anything else that I can tell you? Inquired Mr. Hammond. Thank you, no, said Poirot, rising. All my excuses for having deranged you. Not at all, not at all. The word derange, I remarked, when we were outside again, is applicable to mental disorder only. Ah, cried Poirot, never will my English be quite perfect. A curious language. I should then have said disarranged, nsce pas. Disturbed is the word you had in mind. Thank you, my friend. The word exact, you are zealous for it. Eh bien, what about our friend Parker now? With £20,000 in hand, would he have continued being a butler? Je pense pas. It is, of course, possible that he banked the money under another name, but I am disposed to believe he spoke the truth to us. If he is a scoundrel, he is a scoundrel on a mean scale. He has not the big ideas. That leaves us as a possibility, Raymond, or well Major Blunt. Surely not Raymond, I objected. Since we know that he was desperately hard up for a matter of £500. That is what he says, yes. And as to Hector Blunt, will tell you something as to the good Major Blunt, interrupted Poirot. It is my business to make inquiries. I make them. Eh bien, that legacy of which he speaks, I have discovered that the amount of it was close upon £20,000. What do you think of that? I was so taken aback that I could hardly speak. It's impossible, I said at last. A well-known man like Hector Blunt. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. Who knows? At least he is a man with big ideas. I confess that I hardly see him as a blackmailer, but there is another possibility that you have not even considered. What is that? The fire, my friend. Ackroyd himself may have destroyed that letter, blue envelope, and all. After you left him. I'll hardly think that likely, I said slowly. And yet of course, it may be so. He might have changed his mind. We had just arrived at my house, and on the spur of the moment I invited Poirot to come in and take potluck. I thought Caroline would be pleased with me, but it is hard to satisfy one's womenfolk. It appears that we were eating chops for lunch, the kitchen staff being regaled on tripe and onions. And 2 chops set before 3 people are productive of embarrassment. But Caroline is seldom daunted for long. With magnificent mendacity, she explained to Poirot that although James laughed at her for doing so, she adhered strictly to a vegetarian diet. She descanted ecstatically on the delights of nut cutlets, which I am quite sure she has never tasted, and ate a Welsh rarebit with gusto and frequent cutting remarks as to the dangers of flesh foods. Afterwards, when we were sitting in front of the fire and smoking, Caroline attacked Poirot directly. "Not found Ralph Peyton yet?" she asked. "Where should I find him, mademoiselle?" "Elle thought, perhaps, you'd found him in Cranchester," said Caroline, with intense meaning in her tone. Poirot looked merely bewildered. "In Cranchester? But why in Cranchester?" I enlightened him with a touch of malice. "One of our ample staff of private detectives happened to see you in a car on the Cranchester road yesterday," I explained. Poirot's bewilderment vanished. He laughed heartily. "Ah, that. A simple visit to the dentist, say tout. My tooth, it aches. I go there. My tooth, it is at once better. I think to rid 'em quickly. The dentist, he says no. Better to have it out. I argue. He insists. He has his way. That particular tooth, it will never ache again." Caroline collapsed rather like a pricked balloon. "We fell to discussing Ralph Peyton, a weak nature," I insisted. "But not a vicious one." "Ah," said Poirot. "But weakness, where does it end?" "Exactly," said Caroline. "Take James here, weak as water, if I weren't about to look after him." "My dear Caroline," I said irritably, "can't you talk without dragging in personalities?" "You are weak, James," said Caroline, quite unmoved. "I'm 8 years older than you are. Oh, I don't mind M. Poirot knowing that. Elle should never have guessed it, mademoiselle," said Poirot, with a gallant little bow. 8 years older. But I've always considered it my duty to look after you. With a bad bringing up, heaven knows what mischief you might have got into by now. Elle might have married a beautiful adventuress," I murmured, gazing at the ceiling, and blowing smoke rings. "Adventuress," said Caroline, with a snort. "If we're talking of adventuresses," she left the sentence unfinished. "Well," I said, with some curiosity. "Nothing. But I can think of someone not 100 miles away." Then she turned to Poirot suddenly. "James sticks to it that you believe someone in the house committed the murder. All I can say is, you're wrong." "Elle should not like to be wrong," said Poirot. "It is not how do you say my métier. I've got the facts pretty clearly," continued Caroline, taking no notice of Poirot's remark, "from James and others. As far as I can see, of the people in the house, only 2 could have had the chance of doing it. Ralph Peyton and Flora Ackroyd. My dear Caroline, now, James, don't interrupt me. I know what I'm talking about. Parker met her outside the door, didn't he? He didn't hear her uncle saying good night to her. She could have killed him then and there." "Caroline. I'm not saying she did, James. I'm saying she could have done. As a matter of fact, though Flora is like all these young girls nowadays, with no veneration for their betters and thinking they know best on every subject under the sun, I don't for a minute believe she'd kill even a chicken. But there it is. Mr. Raymond and Major Blunt have alibis. Mrs. Ackroyd's got an alibi. Even that Russell woman seems to have one, and a good job for her it is she has. Who is left? Only Ralph and Flora. And say what you will, I don't believe Ralph Peyton is a murderer. A boy we've known all our lives." Poirot was silent for a minute, watching the curling smoke rise from his cigarette. When at last he spoke, it was in a gentle faraway voice that produced a curious impression. It was totally unlike his usual manner. "Let us take a man, a very ordinary man. A man with no idea of murder in his heart. There is in him somewhere a strain of weakness deep down. It has so far never been called into play. Perhaps it never will be, and if so, he will go to his grave honored and respected by everyone. But let us suppose that something occurs. He is in difficulties, or perhaps not that even. He may stumble by accident on a secret involving life or death to someone. And his first impulse will be to speak out, to do his duty as an honest citizen. And then the strain of weakness tells, here is a chance of money, a great amount of money. He wants money, he desires it, and it is so easy. He has to do nothing for it, just keep silence. That is the beginning. The desire for money grows. He must have more and more. He is intoxicated by the gold mine which has opened at his feet. He becomes greedy. And in his greed he overreaches himself. One can press a man as far as one likes, but with a woman one must not press too far. For a woman has at heart a great desire to speak the truth. How many husbands who have deceived their wives go comfortably to their graves, carrying their secret with them? How many wives who have deceived their husbands wreck their lives by throwing the fact in those same husbands' teeth? They have been pressed too far. In a reckless moment, which they will afterwards regret, bien entendu, they fling safety to the winds and turn at bay, proclaiming the truth with great momentary satisfaction to themselves. So it was, I think, in this case. The strain was too great. And so there came your proverb, the death of the goose that laid the golden eggs. But that is not the end. Exposure faced the man of whom we are speaking. And he is not the same man he was, say, a year ago. His moral fiber is blunted. He is desperate. He is fighting a losing battle, and he is prepared to take any means that come to his hand, for exposure means ruin to him. And so the dagger strikes. He was silent for a moment. It was as though he had laid a spell upon the room. I cannot try to describe the impression his words produced. There was something in the merciless analysis, and the ruthless power of vision which struck fear into both of us. Afterwards, he went on softly, the dagger removed, he will be himself again, normal, kindly. But if the need again arises, then once more he will strike. Caroline roused herself at last. "You are speaking of Ralph Peyton," she said. "You may be right, you may not, but you have no business to condemn a man unheard." The telephone bell rang sharply. I went out into the hall, and took off the receiver. "What?" I said. "Yes. Dr. Shepard speaking." I listened for a minute or two, then replied briefly. Replacing the receiver, I went back into the drawing room. "Poirot," I said, "they have detained a man at Liverpool. His name is Charles Kent, and he is believed to be the stranger who visited Fernley that night. They want me to go to Liverpool at once and identify him." Charles Kent half an hour later saw Poirot, myself, and Inspector Raglan in the train on the way to Liverpool. The inspector was clearly very excited. "We may get a line on the blackmailing part of the business, if on nothing else," he declared jubilantly. "He's a rough customer, this fellow, by what I heard over the phone. Takes dope, too. We ought to find it easy to get what we want out of him. If there was the shadow of a motive, nothing's more likely than that he killed Mr. Ackroyd. But in that case, why is young Peyton keeping out of the way? The whole thing's a muddle, that's what it is. By the way, M. Poirot, you were quite right about those fingerprints. They were Mr. Ackroyd's own. I had rather the same idea myself, but I dismissed it as hardly feasible." I smiled to myself. Inspector Raglan was so very plainly saving his face. "As regard this man," said Poirot, "he is not yet arrested, eh?" "No, detained under suspicion." "And what account does he give of himself?" "Precious little," said the inspector, with a grin. "He's a wary bird, I gather. A lot of abuse, but very little more. On arrival at Liverpool, I was surprised to find that Poirot was welcomed with acclamation. Superintendent Hayes, who met us, had worked with Poirot over some case long ago, and had evidently an exaggerated opinion of his powers. "Now we've got M. Poirot here, we shan't be long," he said cheerfully. "L thought you'd retired, monsieur." "So I had, my good Hayes, so I had. But how tedious is retirement! You cannot imagine to yourself the monotony with which day comes after day." "Very likely. So you've come to have a look at our own particular find? Is this Dr. Shepherd? Think you'll be able to identify him, sir?" "I'm not very sure," I said doubtfully. "How did you get hold of him?" inquired Poirot. "Description was circulated, as you know. In the press and privately. Not much to go on, I admit. This fellow has an American accent all right, and he doesn't deny that he was near King's Abbot that night. Just asks what the hell it is to do with us, and that he'll see us in before he answers any questions." "Is it permitted that to see him?" asked Poirot. The superintendent closed one eye knowingly. "Very glad to have you, sir. You've got permission to do anything you please. Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard was asking after you the other day. Said he'd heard you were connected unofficially with this case. Where's Captain Peyton hiding, sir? Can you tell me that?" "I'll doubt if it would be wise at the present juncture," said Poirot primly, and I bit my lips to prevent a smile. The little man really did it very well. After some further parley, we were taken to interview the prisoner. He was a young fellow, I should say not more than 22 or 3. Tall, thin, with slightly shaking hands, and the evidences of considerable physical strength somewhat run to seed. His hair was dark, but his eyes were blue and shifty, seldom meeting a glance squarely. I had all along cherished the illusion that there was something familiar about the figure I had met that night, but if this were indeed he, I was completely mistaken. He did not remind me in the least of anyone I knew. "Now then, Kent," said the superintendent. "Stand up. Here are some visitors come to see you. Recognize any of them?" Kent glared at us sullenly, but did not reply. I saw his glance waver over the 3 of us, and come back to rest on me. "Well, sir," said the superintendent to me, "what do you say?" "The height's the same," I said, "and as far as general appearance goes it might well be the man in question. Beyond that, I couldn't go." "What the hell's the meaning of all this?" asked Kent. "What have you got against me? Come on, out with it. What am I supposed to have done?" "I'm my head." "It's the man," I said. "I'll recognize the voice." "Recognize my voice, do you? Where do you think you heard it before?" "On Friday evening last, outside the gates of Fernley Park." "You asked me the way there?" "L did L. "Do you admit it?" asked the inspector. "L don't admit anything. Not till I know what you've got on me." "Have you not read the papers in the last few days?" asked Poirot, speaking for the first time. The man's eyes narrowed. "So that's it, is it? I saw an old gent had been croaked at Fernley. Trying to make out I did the job, are you?" "You were there that night," said Poirot quietly. "How do you know, mister?" "By this." Poirot took something from his pocket and held it out. It was the goose quill we had found in the summer house. At the sight of it the man's face changed. He half held out his hand. "No," said Poirot thoughtfully. "No, my friend, it is empty. It lay where you dropped it in the summer house that night." Charles Kent looked at him uncertainly. "You seem to know a hell of a lot about everything, you little foreign cock-duck. Perhaps you remember this, the papers say that the old gent was croaked between 10:15 and 10 o'clock. "That is so," agreed Poirot. "Yes, but is it really so? That's what I'm getting at. This gentleman will tell you," said Poirot. He indicated Inspector Raglan. The latter hesitated, glanced at Superintendent Hayes, then at Poirot, and finally, as though receiving sanction, he said, "That's right. Between 10:15 and 10 o'clock. "Then you've nothing to keep me here for," said Kent. I was away from Fernley Park by 25 minutes past 9. You can ask at the Dog and Whistle. That's a saloon about a mile out of Fernley on the road to Cranchester. I kicked up a bit of a row there, I remember. As near as nothing to 9:45, it was. How about that? Inspector Raglan wrote down something in his notebook. Well, demanded Kent. Inquiries will be made, said the inspector. If you've spoken the truth, you won't have anything to complain about. What were you doing at Fernley Park anyway? Went there to meet someone. Who? That's none of your business. You'd better keep a civil tongue in your head, my man, the superintendent warned him. To hell with a civil tongue. I went there on my own business, and that's all there is to it. If I was clear away before the murder was done, that's all that concerns the cops. Your name, it is Charles Kent, said Poirot. Where were you born? The man stared at him, then he grinned. I'm a full-blown Britisher all right, he said. Yes, said Poirot meditatively. I'll think you are. I fancy you were born in Kent. The man stared. Why's that? Because of my name. What's that to do with it? Is a man whose name is Kent bound to be born in that particular county? Under certain circumstances, I can imagine he might be, said Poirot very deliberately. Under certain circumstances, you comprehend. There was so much meaning in his voice as to surprise the two police officers. As for Charles Kent, he flushed a brick red, and for a moment I thought he was going to spring at Poirot. He thought better of it, however, and turned away with a kind of laugh. Poirot nodded as though satisfied, and made his way out through the door. He was joined presently by the two officers. We'll verify that statement, remarked Raglan. Don't think he's lying, though. But he's got to come clean with a statement as to what he was doing at Fernley. It looks to me as though we'd got our blackmailer all right. On the other hand, granted his story's correct, he couldn't have had anything to do with the actual murder. He'd got £10 on him when he was arrested, rather a large sum. I fancy that £40 went to him. The numbers of the notes didn't correspond, but of course he'd have changed them first thing. Mr. Ackroyd must have given him the money, and he made off with it as fast as possible. What was that about Kent being his birthplace? What's that got to do with it? Nothing whatever, said Poirot mildly. A little idea of mine, that was all. Me, I am famous for my little ideas. Are you really? Said Raglan, studying him with a puzzled expression. The superintendent went into a roar of laughter. Many's the time I've heard Inspector Japp say that. Poirot and his little ideas. Too fanciful for me, he'd say, but always something in them. You mock yourself at me, said Poirot, smiling, but never mind. The old ones they laugh last sometimes, when the young, clever ones do not laugh at all. And his head at them in a sage manner he walked out into the street. He and I lunched together at an hotel. I know now that the whole thing lay clearly unraveled before him. He had got the last thread he needed to lead him to the truth. But at the time I had no suspicion of the fact. I overestimated his general self-confidence, and I took it for granted that the things which puzzled me must be equally puzzling to him. My chief puzzle was what the man Charles Kent could have been doing at Fernley. Again and again I put the question to myself and could get no satisfactory reply. At last I ventured a tentative query to Poirot. His reply was immediate. Mon ami, I do not think, I know. Really? I said incredulously. Yes, indeed. I suppose now that to you it would not make sense if I said that he went to Fernley that night because he was born in Kent. I stared at him. It certainly doesn't seem to make sense to me, I said drily. Ah, said Poirot pityingly. Well, no matter. I have still my little idea. Flora Ackroyd. As I was returning from my round the following morning, I was hailed by Inspector Raglan. I pulled up, and the inspector mounted on the step. Good morning, Dr. Shepherd, he said. Well, that alibi is all right enough. Charles Kent's. Charles Kent's. The barmaid at the Dog and Whistle, Sally Jones, she remembers him perfectly. picked out his photograph from among 5 others. It was just 9:15 when he came into the bar, and the Dog and Whistle is well over a mile from Fernley Park. The girl mentions that he had a lot of money on him. She saw him take a handful of notes out of his pocket. Rather surprised her, it did, seeing the class of fellow he was, with a pair of boots clean dropping off him. That's where that £40 went right enough. The man still refuses to give an account of his visit to Fernley. Obstinate as a mule he is. I had a chat with Hayes at Liverpool over the wire this morning. Hercule Poirot says he knows the reason the man went there that night, I observed. Does he? Cried the inspector eagerly. Yes, I said maliciously. He says he went there because he was born in Kent. I felt a distinct pleasure in passing on my own discomfiture. Raglan stared at me for a moment or two uncomprehendingly. Then a grin overspread his weaselly countenance and he tapped his forehead significantly. Bit gone here, he said. I've thought so for some time. Poor old chap, so that's why he had to give up and come down here. In the family, very likely. He's got a nephew who's quite off his crumpet. Poirot has? I said, very surprised. Yes. Hasn't he ever mentioned him to you? Quite docile, I believe, and all that, but mad as a hatter, poor lad. Who told you that? Again a grin showed itself on Inspector Raglan's face. Your sister. Miss Shepherd, she told me all about it. Really, Caroline is amazing. She never rests until she knows the last details of everybody's family secrets. Unfortunately, I have never been able to instill into her the decency of keeping them to herself. Jump in, Inspector, I said, opening the door of the car. We'll go up to the Larches together, and acquaint our Belgian friend with the latest news. Might as well, I suppose. After all, even if he is a bit balmy, it was a useful tip he gave me about those fingerprints. He's got a bee in his bonnet about the man Kent, but who knows, there may be something useful behind it. Poirot received us with his usual smiling courtesy. He listened to the information we had brought him, nodding his head now and then. Seems quite zero-K, doesn't it? Said the inspector rather gloomily. A chap can't be murdering someone in one place when he's drinking in the bar in another place a mile away. Are you going to release him? Don't see what else we can do. We can't very well hold him for obtaining money on false pretenses. Can't prove a ruddy thing. The inspector tossed a match into the grate in a disgruntled fashion. Poirot retrieved it and put it neatly in a little receptacle designed for the purpose. His action was purely mechanical. I could see that his thoughts were on something very different. If I were you, he said at last, L should not release the man Charles Kent yet. What do you mean? Raglan stared at him. What I say? I should not release him yet. You don't think he can have had anything to do with the murder, do you? L think probably not, but one cannot be certain yet. But haven't I just told you? Poirot raised a hand protestingly. Mais oui. I heard. I am not deaf or stupid, thank the God. But you see, you approach the matter from the wrong premises, is not that the word? The inspector stared at him heavily. L don't see how you make that out. Look here, we know Mr. Ackroyd was alive at 9:45. You admit that, don't you? Poirot looked at him for a moment, then shook his head with a quick smile. I'll admit nothing that is not proved. Well, we've got proof enough of that. We've got Miss Flora Ackroyd's evidence. That she said good night to her uncle? But me, I do not always believe what a young lady tells me, no, not even when she is charming and beautiful. But hang it all, man, Parker saw her coming out of the door. No. Poirot's voice rang out with sudden sharpness. That is just what he did not see. I satisfied myself of that by a little experiment the other day, you remember, Doctor? Parker saw her outside the door, with her hand on the handle. He did not see her come out of the room. But where else could she have been? Perhaps on the stairs. The stairs. That is my little idea, yes. But those stairs only lead to Mr. Ackroyd's bedroom. Precisely. And still the inspector stared. You think she'd been up to her uncle's bedroom? Well, why not? Why should she lie about it? Ah, that is just the question. It depends on what she was doing there, does it not? You mean the money? Hang it all, you don't suggest that it was Miss Ackroyd who took that £40. I'll suggest nothing, said Poirot. But I will remind you of this. Life was not very easy for that mother and daughter. There were bills, there was constant trouble over small sums of money. Roger Ackroyd was a peculiar man over money matters. The girl might be at her wit's end for a comparatively small sum. Figure to yourself then what happens. She has taken the money, she descends the little staircase. When she is halfway down she hears the chink of glass from the hall. She has not a doubt of what it is, Parker coming to the study. At all costs she must not be found on the stairs. Parker will not forget it, he will think it odd. If the money is missed, Parker is sure to remember having seen her come down those stairs. She has just time to rush down to the study door with her hand on the handle to show that she has just come out, when Parker appears in the doorway. She says the first thing that comes into her head, a repetition of Roger Ackroyd's orders earlier in the evening, and then goes upstairs to her own room. Yes, but later, persisted the inspector, she must have realized the vital importance of speaking the truth. Why, the whole case hinges on it. Afterwards, said Poirot drily, it was a little difficult for Mademoiselle Flora. She is told simply that the police are here and that there has been a robbery. Naturally she jumps to the conclusion that the theft of the money has been discovered. Her one idea is to stick to her story. When she learns that her uncle is dead she is panic-stricken. Young women do not faint nowadays, monsieur, without considerable provocation. Eh bien. There it is. She is bound to stick to her story, or else confess everything. And a young and pretty girl does not like to admit that she is a thief, especially before those whose esteem she is anxious to retain. Raglan brought his fist down with a thump on the table. I'll not believe it, he said. It's not credible. And you've known this all along. The possibility has been in my mind from the first, admitted Poirot. I was always convinced that Mademoiselle Flora was hiding something from us. To satisfy myself, I made the little experiment I told you of. Dr. Shepard accompanied me. A test for Parker, you said it was, I remarked bitterly. Mon ami, said Poirot apologetically, as I told you at the time, one must say something. The inspector rose. There's only one thing for it, he declared. We must tackle the young lady right away. You'll come up to Fernley with me, M. Poirot. Certainly. Dr. Shepard will drive us up in his car. I acquiesced willingly. On inquiry for Miss Ackroyd, we were shown into the billiard room. Flora and Major Hector Blunt were sitting on the long window seat. Good morning, Miss Ackroyd, said the inspector. Can we have a word or two alone with you? Blunt got up at once and moved to the door. What is it? Asked Flora nervously. Don't go, Major Blunt. He can stay, can't he? She asked, turning to the inspector. That's as you like, said the inspector drily. There's a question or two it's my duty to put to you, miss, but I'd prefer to do so privately, and I dare say you'd prefer it also. Flora looked keenly at him. I saw her face grow whiter. Then she turned and spoke to Blunt. I want you to stay, please. Yes, I mean it. Whatever the inspector has to say to me, I'd rather you heard it. Raglan shrugged his shoulders. Well, if you will have it so, that's all there is to it. Now, Miss Ackroyd, M. Poirot here has made a certain suggestion to me. He suggests that you weren't in the study at all last Friday night, that you never saw Mr. Ackroyd to say good night to him, that instead of being in the study you were on the stairs leading down from your uncle's bedroom when you heard Parker coming across the hall. Flora's gaze shifted to Poirot. He nodded back at her. Mademoiselle, the other day, when we sat round the table, I implored you to be frank with me. What one does not tell to Papa Poirot he finds out. It was that, was it not? See, I will make it easy for you. You took the money, did you not? The money, said Blunt sharply. There was a silence which lasted for at least a minute. Then Flora drew herself up and spoke. M. Poirot is right. I took that money. I stole. I am a thief, yes, a common, vulgar little thief. Now you know. I am glad it has come out. It's been a nightmare, these last few days. She sat down suddenly and buried her face in her hands. She spoke huskily through her fingers. You don't know what my life has been since I came here. Wanting things, scheming for them, lying, cheating, running up bills, promising to pay. Oh, I hate myself when I think of it all. That's what brought us together, Ralph and Elle. We were both weak. Him, and I was sorry because I'm the same underneath. We're not strong enough to stand alone, either of us. We're weak, miserable, despicable things. She looked at Blunt and suddenly stamped her foot. Why do you look at me like that, as though you couldn't believe? I may be a thief, but at any rate I'm real now. I'm not lying anymore. I'm not pretending to be the kind of girl you like, young and innocent and simple. I don't care if you never want to see me again. I hate myself, despise myself, but you've got to believe one thing: if speaking the truth would have made things better for Ralph, I would have spoken out. But I've seen all along that it wouldn't be better for Ralph. It makes the case against him blacker than ever. I was not doing him any harm by sticking to my lie. Ralph, said Blunt. I see always, Ralph. You don't understand, said Flora hopelessly. You never will. She turned to the inspector. I'll admit everything. I was at my wits' end for money. I never saw my uncle that evening after he left the dinner table. As to the money, you can take what steps you please. Nothing could be worse than it is now. Suddenly she broke down again, hid her face in her hands, and rushed from the room. Well, said the inspector in a flat tone, so that's that. He seemed rather at a loss what to do next. Blunt came forward. Inspector Raglan, he said quietly, that money was given to me by Mr. Ackroyd for a special purpose. Miss Ackroyd never touched it. When she says she did, she is lying with the idea of shielding Captain Peyton. The truth is as I said, and I am prepared to go into the witness box and swear to it. He made a kind of jerky bow, then turning abruptly he left the room. Poirot was after him in a flash. He caught the other up in the hall. Monsieur, a moment, I beg of you, if you will be so good. Well, sir. Blunt was obviously impatient. He frowning down on Poirot. It is this, said Poirot rapidly, I am not deceived by your little fantasy. No, indeed. It was truly Miss Flora who took the money. All the same, it is well imagined what you say. It pleases me. It is very good what you have done there. You are a man quick to think and to act. I'm not in the least anxious for your opinion, thank you, said Blunt coldly. He made once more as though to pass on, but Poirot, not at all offended, laid a detaining hand on his arm. Ah! But you are to listen to me. I have more to say. The other day I spoke of concealments. Very well, all along I have seen what you are concealing. Mademoiselle Flora, you love her with all your heart. From the first moment you saw her, is it not so? Oh! Let us not mind saying these things. Why must one in England think it necessary to mention love as though it were some disgraceful secret? You love Mademoiselle Flora. You seek to conceal that fact from all the world. That is very as it should be. But take the advice of Hercule Poirot, do not conceal it from Mademoiselle herself. Blunt had shown several signs of restlessness whilst Poirot was speaking, but the closing words seemed to rivet his attention. What do you mean by that? He said sharply. You think that she loves the Capitaine Ralph Peyton, but Hercule Poirot, tell you that that is not so. Mademoiselle Flora accepted Captain Peyton to please her uncle, and because she saw in the marriage a way of escape from her life here which was becoming frankly insupportable to her. She liked him, and there was much sympathy and understanding between them. But love, no. It is not Captain Peyton Mademoiselle Flora loves. What the devil do you mean? Asked Blunt. I saw the dark flush under his tan. You have been blind, monsieur. Blind. She is loyal, the little one. Ralph Peyton is under a cloud, she is bound in honor to stick by him. I felt it was time I put in a word to help on the good work. My sister told me the other night, I said encouragingly, that Flora had never cared a penny piece for Ralph Peyton, and never would. My sister is always right about these things. Blunt ignored my well-meant offers. He spoke to Poirot. "Do you really think," he began, and stopped. He is one of those inarticulate men who find it hard to put things into words. Poirot knows no such disability. "If you doubt me, ask her yourself, monsieur. But perhaps you no longer care to the affair of the money." Blunt gave a sound like an angry laugh. "Think I'd hold that against her? Roger was always a queer chap about money. She got in a mess and didn't dare tell him. Poor kid. Poor lonely kid." Poirot looked thoughtfully at the side door. "Mademoiselle Flora went into the garden, I think," he murmured. "I've been every kind of a fool," said Blunt abruptly. "Rum conversation we've been having. Like one of those Danish plays. But you're a sound fellow, M. Poirot." "Thank you." He took Poirot's hand and gave it a grip which caused the other to wince in anguish. Then he strode to the side door and passed out into the garden. "Not every kind of a fool," murmured Poirot, tenderly nursing the injured member. "Only one kind, the fool in love." Miss Russell. Inspector Raglan had received a bad jolt. He was not deceived by Blunt's valiant lie any more than we had been. Our way back to the village was punctuated by his complaints. "This alters everything, this does. I don't know whether you've realized it, Monsieur Poirot." "I'll think so, yes, I think so," said Poirot. "You see, I have been familiar with the idea for some time." Inspector Raglan, who had only had the idea presented to him a short half-hour ago, looked at Poirot unhappily, and went on with his discoveries. "Those alibis now. Worthless. Absolutely worthless. Got to start again. Find out what everyone was doing from 9:30 onwards. 9:30, that's the time we've got to hang on to. You were quite right about the man Kent, we don't release him yet a while. Let me see now, 9:45 at the Dog and Whistle. He might have got there in a quarter of an hour if he ran. It's just possible that it was his voice Mr. Raymond heard talking to Mr. Ackroyd asking for money which Mr. Ackroyd refused. But one thing's clear, it wasn't he who sent the telephone message. The station is half a mile in the other direction, over a mile and a half from the Dog and Whistle, and he was at the Dog and Whistle until about 10 minutes past 10. Dang that telephone call. We always come up against it." "We do indeed," agreed Poirot. "It is curious. It's just possible that if Captain Peyton climbed into his uncle's room and found him there murdered, he may have sent it. Got the wind up, thought he'd be accused, and cleared out. That's possible, isn't it? Why should he have telephoned? May have had doubts if the old man was really dead. Thought he'd get the doctor up there as soon as possible, but didn't want to give himself away. Yes, I say now, how's that for a theory? Something in that, I should say." The inspector swelled his chest out importantly. He was so plainly delighted with himself that any words of ours would have been quite superfluous. "We arrived back at my house at this minute, and I hurried into my surgery patients, who had all been waiting a considerable time, leaving Poirot to walk to the police station with the inspector. Having dismissed the last patient, I strolled into the little room at the back of the house which I call my workshop. I am rather proud of the homemade wireless set I turned out. Caroline hates my workroom. I have kept my tools there, and Annie is not allowed to wreak havoc with the dustpan and brush. I was just adjusting the interior of an alarm clock which had been denounced as wholly unreliable by the household, when the door opened and Caroline put her head in. "Oh, there you are, James," she said, with deep disapproval. "M. Poirot wants to see you." "Well," I said, rather irritably, for her sudden entrance had startled me and I had let go of a piece of delicate mechanism. "If he wants to see me, he can come in here." "In here," said Caroline. "That's what I said, in here." Caroline gave a sniff of disapproval and retired. She returned in a moment or two, ushering in Poirot, and then retired again, shutting the door with a bang. "Aha! My friend," said Poirot, coming forward and rubbing his hands. "You have not got rid of me so easily, You see? Finished with the inspector? I asked.